Okay, yes. Okay, perfect. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar and unfamiliar faces, including a very cute little baby. Hello there. Yeah, I am Li-hsin Hsu from Taiwan, currently at Washington, D.C., actually for another conference. It feels very surreal to be so close to the White House at this very challenging, difficult political climate. We're so delighted to have three speakers here, Beverly, Alexandra, and Mila. So maybe we will start with the first speaker now, Beverly. Her topic is flood subjects, Dickinson and the Deluge. Would you like to go ahead, Beverly? Yes.
Yes, sure. And is it all right if I share my screen?
Please go ahead.
Perfect, thank you. Yes, so my project is called Flood Subjects, and I am looking at Dickinson's poetic adaptations of the story of Noah's flood. And in the poems and letters that I look at, Dickinson engages not only with the biblical flood, but also with catastrophist diluvial theory, which was an apologist subtradition of natural theology that reconciled Genesis and geology with the biblical deluge. And so Dickinson wrote the majority of her poems after catastrophism's collapse around 1860, but she studied geology during the movement's peak under Edward Hitchcock. Hitchcock was America's leading proponent of diluvial theory and an Amherst professor of geology and natural theology who devoted his career to reconciling science and scripture. And so overall, I'm going to argue that Dickinson uses the flood, which had been disproven by the time she began writing, to navigate the conflict between science and theology triggered by Darwin and catastrophism's downfall. But first is some background. So early in the 19th century, geology became the first natural science to undermine Christianity and the Bible because deep time, or the discovery of the Earth's age, contradicted the 6,000-year chronology of Genesis. But through the mid-century, geology's threats to Christianity remained unrealized due to catastrophism. This was the predominant scientific paradigm in the US from the 1820s through the late 1850s. And catastrophists argued that over the course of deep time, God had created and destroyed several successive varieties of species by unleashing universal earthquakes and tsunamis. And these functioned as mass extinction events, ushering in increasingly perfect species to advance the plan of the Creator. And so Noah's flood was the most recent of these events and coincided with the inception of all species currently in existence, which emerged just 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. And the flood occurred near the dawn of human history to eliminate inferior species and reshape the environment, which paved the way for humans to culminate God's plan. But by the late 1850s, catastrophism became incompatible with an increasingly sophisticated fossil record, and Americans were forced to accept the secularized uniformitarian geology of Charles Lyell. Lyell refuted the flood, advocating instead for the separation of science and theology, and he established the naturalistic approach that Darwin would later adopt in On the Origin of Species. So in this way, catastrophism's collapse foregrounded a crisis that would reach its apex with the publication of Darwin's Origin in 1859, which cemented the downfall of natural theology altogether. This crisis is often referred to as the 1860 scientific revolution or Darwinian revolution, which refers to the 1860 paradigm shift from an alliance to an antagonism between science and Christianity. And this shift inaugurated a secularized new science that substituted natural law for divine intervention, which subverted the idea of God's involvement in the natural world and undermined biblical history and eschatology. And so Dickinson's poetic career commenced on the brink of this 1860 scientific revolution, which dismantled catastrophism and invalidated the flood. But she continues to revisit the flood throughout her poems and letters and to engage at length with Hitchcock's disproven theory. And these flood poems are consistently characterized by expressions of scientifically informed religious doubt. So the question that motivates this project is, why does the flood, which was an anachronism by 1860, retain such a pervasive presence in Dickinson's work? And I answer this question by arguing that the flood evokes the theological consequences of the 1860 scientific revolution. Specifically, it conjures the 1860 paradigm shift away from the religious science of natural theology, which informed her formal education in geology, and towards the irreligious science of Lyell and Darwin, which informed her adult struggle with religious doubt. So I draw on Folsom and Price, who have shown how Dickinson converts select phrases into vortex words that organize and abbreviate broader cultural contexts. These are culturally charged phrases and images that acquire their own independent meanings within Dickinson's lexicon. Often they function as organizing concepts that indicate a whole structure of meaning that permeates a poem, and they encode the poems in which they occur as meditations on specific historical contexts. And so I argued that Dickinson uses the flood, which was once emblematic of the alliance between science and Christianity, to signify the broader cultural context of antagonism between science and theology that erupted at the outset of her poetic career. And so as a vortex metaphor linked to this scientific revolution, the flood organizes and abbreviates three key contexts and complications of post-1860 religious life. These include the consequences of natural theology's collapse for views of nature and personal faith, the implications of Lyell and Darwin's irreligious science or uniformitarianism for perceptions of history, and post-Darwinian doubt in the biblical doctrine of immortality, which Dickinson called the flood subject. So I suggest that the flood encodes Dickinson's poems as meditations on these developments and contextualizes the doubt that she expresses as a byproduct of the changing relationship between science and religion. And so the first context that I look at involves natural theology's collapse, which Dickinson deals with in this poem entitled The Voice That Stands for Floods. And so as the centerpiece of Hitchcock's endeavor to reconcile Genesis and geology, here floods constellate what Dickinson perceived as the most pressing consequences of natural theology's demise in this poem, which deals with the destabilization of a theology unmoored from the substance of scientific evidence and reconceptualized as the exclusive poverty of blind faith, a division between matter and spirit, which evacuated religious meaning from nature and lived experience, and a sense of disillusion at the superficial cultural values, such as finance, that have supplanted discourses of nature's divinity. So often these flood poems depict Gilded Age capitalism as a substitution for religious meaning. And then the second context that I look at involves uniformitarianism and the issue of history after 1860. So in addition to signifying natural theology's failures, the flood also evokes the 1860 triumph of the irreligious uniformitarian science of Lyell and Darwin. And often Dickinson's flood poems deal with the disillusion conditioned by uniformitarians' aimless, non-theocentric vision of history, where, as Stephen Jay Gould puts it, time has no direction and events have no meaning. And so in the poems, the winters are so short, glee the great storm is over, and like rain it sounded till it curbed. Dickinson navigates this recent paradigm shift from catastrophist to uniformitarian visions of history. Each of these poems adheres to a consistent structural formula. She retells disproven stories of the flood, only to conclude by dismissing the deluge as a legend now. And she does this in terms that mimic Lyell and Darwin's rejection of catastrophism as anti-empirical. So in keeping with the uniformitarian idea that the present is key to the past, Dickinson contrasts the flood to contemporary processes, such as storms and seasons, to depict a world characterized by cyclical, predictable changes that appear incompatible with catastrophist, spontaneous, universal disasters. Simultaneously, though, she expresses nostalgia for these disproven biblical and catastrophist histories, such as the flood or the fall, that justified the course of environmental history. And so here are two examples. These poems adhere to the structural formula that I just talked about, and they bring up the issue of history by pairing the flood with winter. And these are related in two different ways. First, the flood and winter are linked in biblical history through the Noahide covenant. And this is God's promise to Noah that he will, quote, never again flood the earth while the earth remaineth. Day and night and summer and winter shall not cease. But they're also related as symbols for catastrophist versus uniformitarian history, and they conjure the conflict between what Stephen Jay Gould calls time's arrow and time's cycle. So with the flood and winter, Dickinson creates a symbolic paradigm that contrasts linear and cyclical temporality, and this conjures the competing visions of geohistory at the heart of the catastrophist uniformitarian debate. So with the flood, she evokes linear, catastrophist, and biblical etiologies that rationalize the present based on singular past events, such as the flood or the fall, that determine the course of history. And this is what Gould calls time's arrow, which is the primary metaphor in biblical histories featuring storylines of past that determine presents and constrain futures. whereas winter was Lyell's own uniformitarian metaphor for a cyclical, repetitive history governed by processes currently in effect. And this is time's cycle, where time has no direction and events have no meaning. And so with the flood and winter, these poems navigate the 1860 paradigm shift from catastrophism to uniformitarianism, and with it from theocentric to naturalistic visions of history. And then the third and final context that I look at involves Darwinism and immortality. So Dickinson's letters refer to immortality as the flood subject, and the flood recurs throughout her poems, expressing skepticism towards the Christian afterlife. And this skepticism is rooted in Darwin, who, by revealing our evolution from animals, challenged the idea of human special creation as a distinct species with an immortal soul. But few scholars have thought about why Dickinson refers to immortality as the flood subject. Interpreted literally, the flood is unrelated to the afterlife. But when we interpret the flood as a vortex metaphor linked to the Darwinian revolution, it evokes the scientific context responsible for her skepticism towards immortality, and it encodes her doubt in the afterlife as a byproduct of contemporary science. So in an 1866 letter to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and the poem We Talked with Each Other About Each Other, as well as various other poems, Dickinson connects the flood with immortality on two interrelated registers. The first is scientific. She pairs the flood with immortality as biblical casualties of the 1860 scientific revolution that coincided with Darwin's origin and catastrophism's collapse. And the second is typological. She revisits the biblical type-antitype connection between the Old Testament flood and the New Testament resurrection, when the mortal will put on immortality. And so by pairing immortality with a disproven flood, Dickinson extends scientific skepticism from the Old Testament past into the New Testament future. And so here's an example of how this phrase works in an 1866 letter to Thomas Wentworth Higginson. And Dickinson writes, "Still I have the hill, my Gibraltar remnant. Nature, seems it to myself, plays without a friend. You mention immortality, that is the flood subject. I was told the bank is the safest place for a finless mind." So here, the flood functions as an organizing concept that constellates the consequences of contemporary science, and it aligns her doubt in immortality with other key repercussions of the Darwinian revolution. So first she mentions the hill. This recurs throughout her poems, linking the flood with immortality, and it appears to coincide with the hill of science referenced in her early work. She also brings up a secularized view of nature operating without a friend or in the absence of a divine conductor. And this is Darwinian view of nature governed not by God, but by secondary natural laws. And then she mentions the bank. Often these poems contrast the flood with the bank or finance to depict capitalism as a post-Darwinian substitution for spirituality. And so by saying the bank is the safest place for a finless mind, Dickinson suggests that the bank has become safer than Christianity by 1866, or that capitalism presents a more stable, reliable investment than a theology under attack by science. Simultaneously, though, the phrase bank evokes dry land. And so by linking bank and finless with the flood and immortality, Dickinson frames her struggle for belief in the afterlife by conjuring the prospect of drowning. And this is a recurring motif in her poems linking the flood with immortality, and it evokes the typological correlation between the flood's victims and the New Testament skeptics who, like Dickinson in this letter, distrust preachings of Christ, the afterlife, and the resurrection. And so to wrap up, the flood is largely neglected in Dickinson's scholarship, despite its centrality to her scientific education and poetry. And by restoring relevance to the Deluge, I hope to show through these poems the extent to which conflicts between science and theology shaped her perspective, not only on religion, but also on other key topics such as nature, history, futurity, and the afterlife. Because these poems contain a diluvial code, it reveals the precise thinkers, context, and traditions implicated in her struggle with religious belief. And catastrophism also creates new opportunities to situate Dickinson in relation to the recent geologic turn in Anthropocene scholarship, because these flood poems describe the precise forms of planetary instability that we currently face. She mentions great storms, despoiled climates, and lifted seas that threaten to sweep the world away. And so through her education under Hitchcock, Dickinson acquired this eco-catastrophic geological sensibility that, even though it was disproven by the time she began writing, now yields prescient glimpses into the future of the Anthropocene. That is all.
Thank you so much, Beverly. That's so insightful and rich. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
This we will move on to the second speaker. Alexandra, are you ready? Would you like to share your PowerPoint if you have any?
Uh, Hi, yeah, I'm ready. I don't have a PowerPoint.
Oh, okay, sure. Then
Yeah.
please go ahead when you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my experience writing my paper during last year's Critical Institute session. During this brief but very fruitful meeting that I had with Professor René Bergland, I managed to continue working on my paper, which was entitled Emily Dickinson's Ecopoetics, Seen Through Her Poetry and Herbarium, from a slightly different approach than the one that I had initially considered. Because there is something that I have often thought is sort of the curse of academic writers, which is the way in which tone can slip into something dry, disengaging, sometimes a little complex and maybe a bit boring. And that is something that has always made me feel very self-conscious about my own work, the way I present it to others so they understand what I'm trying to say, while also displaying intellectual rigor and relevance to share with my fellow researchers. And it's a thin line to walk, and I have always struggled with it. However, I figured that if there was ever a time to allow myself to be as free and as personal as I wanted to be in my academic writing, it would be while talking about Emily Dickinson. And it's not because I believe she's somehow less deserving of discipline or respect as a serious research topic. Quite the contrary, of course. And it's because I believe that the best way to honor her work is by means of showing how deep the connection between her poetry and my life goes, in spite of the distance, geographical and chronological distance, that exists between us, because it is precisely that distance what becomes the most evident display of the power of her work. And this revelation actually came to me when I shared with the group that I was in middle school and I was asked to create a small herbarium for my biology class. And that is something that every single child here in Mexico, or at least during my school years, had to do. And I have to admit that I may have cheated the system a little bit because I bought flowers from a street vendor instead of going out to hunt for them, like we were supposed to. But even then, I knew exactly which flowers I was supposed to get to make my teacher believe that I had picked them from the urban gardens that exist around the city. And that, for me, was enough to show the fact that I was observant and discerning about the environment around me. And because I was not going to bring a flower or a plant that would have let the teacher know that I had bought, there were neither flowers nor plants out of season in the herbarium that I compiled. And I don't remember if I shared the whole story during the session, but Professor Bergland suggested that I could include the anecdote as an introduction to my paper, which in turn made me realize that there was a different way that I could frame my research. And as we know, Dickinson's Herbarium is a very carefully curated collection of over 400 pressed plant specimens, which provides a unique framework for understanding her poetic approach to nature, language, and taxonomy. During the 19th century, botany was a field deeply associated with scientific inquiry, and the proof is that it was one of the subjects taught at Mary Li-hsin Hsu Seminary, which Dickinson attended, which is now Mount Holyoke College. The act of collecting and categorizing plants was not merely a pastime, but rather a means of engaging with the natural world through observation and taxonomical organization. However, Dickinson's herbarium reflects her intellectual curiosity while also challenging conventional scientific discourse by transforming botanical specimens into poetic symbols. Because of her taxonomic choices, what she includes in the herbarium, how she arranges the specimens, how she names them, mirror her poetic approach, in which familiar natural elements are reconfigured to produce new meanings. Dickinson's use of plant imagery, where flowers, trees, and other natural elements frequently serve as metaphors for emotional and philosophical inquiries, was a vital part of my research. And as readers, we can notice that her poetry often disrupts traditional botanical symbolism and resists the, let's say, sentimentality often associated with floral language in 19th century culture. and instead she employs it as a means of questioning human relationships with the natural world. Her taxonomic tendencies, which are evident in both her herbarium and her poetry, reflect a broader epistemological engagement with classification systems, including language itself. Just in the way that scientific names impose order upon nature, Dickinson's poetic voice reshapes conventional meanings, challenges fixed interpretations, and invites multiple readings. Therefore, the stated purpose of my article that I was writing back then was to examine the intersection between Dickinson's botanical practices and her poetic techniques by means of the argument that her method of collecting, classifying, and naming plants parallels her poetic strategies of condensation, categorization, and reinterpretation. And by juxtaposing select poems with entries from her herbarium, this work highlights the ways in which Dickinson's engagement with botany shaped her literary imagination and contributed to an alternative form of knowledge making that blended scientific precision with poetic exploration. In a similar way, Dickinson's herbarium functioned as a form of poetic archive, which preserves not only physical specimens, but also the act of observation itself. By pressing plants between pages, she captures fleeting moments of life, much as her poetry encapsulates transient experiences and emotions. The interplay between her physical collection and her written world suggests a complex relationship between preservation and transformation, mirroring the dynamic tension in her poetry between fixity and fluidity. And this analysis would position Dickinson's botanical and poetic practices within the broader intellectual landscape of her time, demonstrating how her work engages with 19th century scientific discourse while also subverting it through poetic innovation. And through the examination of the parallels between her herbarium and her poetry, I aim to shed a new light on Dickinson's ecological consciousness and her unique approach to both taxonomy and artistic expression, while arguing for a reading of Dickinson not only as a poet of nature, but also as a poet of classification, preservation, and reinterpretation, as well as an artist whose engagement with botany was just as radical as her engagement with language itself. And the attempt to obviate the minimal distance between Dickinson's poetry and her botanical archive was already a confrontation of the often binary understanding of her image as a person. She was either very sociable with neighbors or family, as evidenced by the number of notes and letters she sent them along with bouquets of flowers and fruit baskets and other things, or was entirely a recluse, right? Or she was either a skillful gardener or a poet. And this dichotomy can be seen even in her obituary, where Susan Gilbert Dickinson references Emily being better known in town because of her treasures of fruit and flowers and ambrosial dishes for the sick and well, which were also evidences of her unselfish consideration. And her poetry writing is not even acknowledged in the obituary, because as we know, no one really knew that she was writing so many poems in her time, not even aside from the fact that said gifts were often, if not always, accompanied by poems. And with the perspective given by time and several studies of Dickinson's work, we know that she was both. She was a talented gardener and a talented poet, and her herbarium is a display of the intersection between the two. So if science, both scholarly and empirical, allowed Dickinson to remain close to her interest in nature, poetry allowed her to express it beyond the merely scientific. More than being a hobby, the keeping of her herbarium was a register of her own act of observation of nature, which could then translate into the poetic. To her, flowers, plants were not merely objects found in the environment that could become objects to her poetry, but through them and her literary reasonings, she found a deeper connection between herself and the living creatures with which she shared the world. And this positions the study in the frame of ecopoetics, which the Poetry Foundation website defines as a theory that places emphasis on drawing connections between human activity, specifically the writing of poems, and the environment that produces it. It arose of the increasing awareness of ecology and concerns over environmental disaster in the late 20th century. And Forrest Gander mentions that whereas native poetry often takes for its themes the so-called natural world as though it was separate from the human world, ecopoetry asks how we are involved in and a part of all that surrounds us. Ecopoets attempt to offer insights, both formally and thematically, into the complex interrelationships between nature and cultural language and perception. And even though the term was coined in the 20th century, it is possible to read Dickinson's work from this perspective, since the plants and flowers she relates to in her poetry are often those native to the region, or the ones she grew in her family home's conservatory, which she then elevates into a literary position where they become small windows into divinity and the spiritual. For example, poems such as a sepal, a petal, a thorn, the daisy follows of the sun, the ginseng weaves her fringes, to make a prairie takes a clover or one bee, etc. Reference the flowers and plants Dickinson included in her herbarium. So this doesn't mean that the specimens themselves inspired the poems. However, it does mean that these species were part of her observation process and her poetic abstraction. And looking back at the small herbarium that I assembled as a school assignment many years ago, I realized that what was most interesting to me was never simply the act of preserving plants. It was the act of learning to observe them, to notice differences, their seasons, their names, and ultimately their place within a larger ecosystem. And that childhood exercise unexpectedly became the lens through which I now approach Emily Dickinson's work. Her herbarium invites us to perform the same careful attention, reminds us that observation is never neutral, but it's always an act of interpretation. And observing Dickinson's herbarium alongside her poetry suggests